This was a chess game played between two of the best younger chess players in the world, although I guess in chess terms they're not that young anymore. White is Alireza Firouzja, age 19. Black was played by Jan-Christoph Duda, who's 24 years of age. They both are prodigies, both became grandmasters in their teens. This was played at the FTX Crypto Cup. It's a rapid game, 15 minutes for each side with a 10-second increment. Again, Alireza has white, Duda has black. Let's jump right in. Alireza begins with e4. E5 is the response. So very quickly, we get a Spanish or Ruy Lopez opening. Knight to f6, offering the Berlin system. If white castles here, then just after these sequence of moves, you have a complex endgame. And Firouzja wanted to avoid that and instead played d3, trying to keep the middle game complex, keep queens on the board. Bishop to c5, and here Firouzja goes ahead and chops that knight off at c6. Sometimes he does that only after black provokes it with a6, but this time he just goes right for the structure that he's comfortable with. Pawn takes bishop and knight b to d2. The idea is this knight can go to c4, combine with a knight at f3, and put pressure on this e5 pawn. So Duda plays knight to d7. It defends the pawn and also allows black to play f6 to overprotect this e5 point. Knight to c4 continuing, f6 defending, and now c3. Now that the e5 pawn cannot be captured, white begins to gain space in the middle of the board with d4. Firouzja would love to have a nice full pawn center here. And here Duda plays knight to f8. This is a novelty, and it looks a bit strange to move the knight to the back rank again. But the idea is that the knight wants to be able to pop up at e6 or g6 at some point, and he feels the position is locked enough, he has the time to move the knight back to f8. Bishop to e3, directly challenging that bishop at c5. The bishop doesn't take, then the knight would retake, and white is doing fine. The two bishop advantage is gone. So here, Duda plays bishop to b6. Now, white can grab the bishops here also, but this would at least open the a file, and this clump of four pawns over here actually has some dynamic potential. It controls a lot of squares, so Firouzja doesn't want to give him that. So instead, he just advances in the center with d4, as he originally intended anyway. Duda takes the pawn, and here, Firouzja could take on d4 with the pawn. That's fine. The only problem is that these two pawns become a target for black, and black can build up a lot of pressure, and Firouzja would have to spend all of his time defending the pawns. So instead, what he does is he takes with the knight, and here, he has this structure that's very common in a Ruy Lopez exchange variation, where black has a crippled pawn majority on the queen side versus white's healthy minority. So these, in a king and pawn endgame, these three pawns can always hold these four. Whereas on the king side, white has a healthy majority. So if this were a king and pawn endgame, white would actually be winning. So Firouzja has a good structure. Queen to e7 attacks e4. Castles, ignores the attack because you can't take it right now, because rook to e1, and the queen and king would be lined up, and that would be the end of the game. So now bishop takes knight was played. The knight was threatening to jump into f5. Bishop takes. The two bishops are gone. Now we have bishops of opposite color. And in the middle game, that means some more dynamic options for both sides. Knight to e6 hits the bishop, and Firouzja says, I don't mind. I like my knight in this position. I like the knight versus the bishop. So he plays knight to e3, obviously threatening to pop into f5. So the knight captures the bishop, and now queen takes. So here we have an end game, sort of, or a late middle game, basically, because queens are still on the board. And we see the issues. Basically, we have the pawn structure issue we've discussed. We've got a knight versus a bishop, and then we've got the one open file. So if one side can control that file, they could have a real advantage. Black castles, rook a to d1 to the file, bishop to e6, attacking the a2 pawn. So c4. Firouzja decides to put these central pawns on the same square as his opponent's bishop to limit its mobility. In a late end game, maybe these could become targets, but right now it's good for white to limit that mobility. a5 is played, reducing the ability of white to advance on the queen side, also giving his own queen a place to hang out on b4. Queen goes to c3 and queen to b4, immediately putting pressure on white's queen. White does not want to take the queen, because if he does, he just opens up the a file, and black is developing pressure. So instead, he plays queen to c2 and keeps queens on the board. Rook f to d8, h3, rook to d6, And here Firouzja goes ahead and takes on d6, allowing pawn takes. Now, here he has fixed black's pawn structure. These pawns are no longer doubled. However, this pawn on d6 is weak. These pawns on c4 and e4 keep it in place, and it's like almost like a backwards pawn that white can attack. So rook to d1, immediately attacking the d6 pawn. a4, a3, queen c5, and now rook to d3. What Firouzja wants to do, he wants to double on the d file, but he wants his queen behind the rook. He wants the rook to lead on the d file. King to f7, queen to d1, and now king to e7. The best move, according to the computers, is queen to e5, counterattacking this b2 pawn. If bishop c4 was played, the knight takes, queen takes, rook d6, and here white is very active, and it's really hard on black. If queen takes e4, then rook d7 check, king g6, rook takes b7, and you'd have material equality, but white has a healthier pawn structure and more active pieces. So instead, king to e7 was played, and Firouzja decides to hop in with the knight, knight to f5 check, bishop takes knight, pawn takes, queen takes, rook takes d6. Computers say the better move is rook to e3 check, actually, after king to d7, queen to e1, and that rook is coming into e7 and is going to wreak havoc if instead king to f7, then queen d6, and white is just better. But Firouzja takes on d6, rook to e8, and he wants to just tuck that king back and defend. Now, Firouzja would love to deliver a check on d7. The problem is the queen controls the square, so how do we kick the queen away from its control of d7? He plays the move g4. Now, he does get rid of some of his king's cover, but he wants that queen away. The queen moves, now rook to d7 check is allowed, king to f8, queen to d6 check, king to g8, and rook takes b7. So now, for the moment, white is up a pawn, and what Duda is going to try to do is generate counterplay against white's king, see if he can generate enough counterplay to make up for that loss of material. Queen e1 check, king g2, queen e4 check, king h2, queen e2, threatening queen takes pawn with check, queen comes back to defend, rook to e5. What black wants to do is play the move h5, and then if pawn takes, he just moves the rook over and gets active. King g2, h5 is played. So now queen to f3, offering the exchange of queens. Pawn takes pawn. Now, he could just retake, that would be fine, but instead he plays rook to b8 check, king to f7, queen takes e2, rook takes e2, pawn takes g4. Okay, so we have a very dynamic rook endgame here, and this is really where these players tend to separate at the top level in these endgames. Rook to e4 is immediately played by Duda. Double attack on g4 and f4, and Firouzja plays rook to b4. He says, I'm going to let this pawn go, but I'm going to take this pawn, and what we have here is a race, basically. Whose pawns are faster, Firouzja's queenside pawns or Duda's kingside pawns? Let's see. Rook takes g4 check, king f3, f5 protecting the rook, rook takes a4, g5, excuse me, rook to a5, attacks the f5 pawn, so rook to f4, king to e2, king to e6, rook to c5, attacking the c6 pawn. Now king to d6 irritates this rook, so b4, protecting it. g4 is played. So now what Firouzja wants to do is just take this pawn and run it all the way up the board. So a4, rook to e4 check, king f1, rook to d4. So Duda, in order to stop that pawn, wants to play rook to d1 check and then rook to a1 to put his rook behind this passed a pawn. a5, f4, a6, rook to d1 check. The king goes to g2, and now rook to a1 behind the pawn. Now, this is an amazing moment. This is one of those things. This is grandmaster stuff. Okay, Firouzja, the most obvious move, to me, looks to be rook takes a5, right? You just block this rook so this pawn can advance. The problem is Duda's king is too close, and this would actually lose the game. So rook takes, pawn takes, and then what happens is he just moves his king back to b8, a7, and then he just wins because these two pawns on the king side keep white's king from going anywhere, and eventually he'll just chomp these pawns and win with these two pawns on the king side. But watch this. Firouzja plays rook to f5, hitting the f4 pawn. Now, g3, if he plays rook to a6, then you just take. And white's fine. He's going to take the g4 pawn, and white is just winning. But g3 first, and now a switchback. He plays back rook to a5, and now, by forcing this g4 pawn up one square, this move, rook to a5, goes from losing to winning. Really, really phenomenal. So rook takes, pawn takes, king c7. Now you take here. Now these two pawns aren't here anymore to limit white's king. King b8, king f4, king a7, king e5, king takes a6, and king to d6. And Firouzja arrives in time to win the c6 pawn and queen his c pawn. An amazing, amazing, and very educational rook endgame. By the way, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by clicking the thanks button below. And even after going over this great game from Alireza Firouzja, there is still some great chess that you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to look at is this game right here from Alireza Firouzja. I know you're going to enjoy it.